Started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's event featuring John P. Clark in discussion with artists Liz Lessner and Matt Keel about the second edition of Clark's book, The Impossible Community: Realizing Communitarian Anarchism, as well as their work together on the projects Yes, We Cannibal and the Terre Institute for Community and Ecology. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country and around the world. So if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing global pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. We did just make the exciting announcement this past weekend that our co-op will be moving into a new building in early 2023. The new building will have increased space and air ventilation that will allow for us to return to in-person events, which we are very excited about. And we do need some help at the moment with costs associated with the new building. So if you're interested in supporting our move, I'll drop a link to our crowdfunding campaign in the chat as well. And with all that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up, including Thursday, August 4th, when we host editors Nani Ferreira Matthews and Andrew Zonneveld to discuss the release of their new book, Why Anarchists Don't Vote: Radical Criticisms of Representative Government, out from on our own authority books. So if you're interested in signing up for that one or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And a note for those of you who are attending in the live audience tonight, our speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Okay, cool. Moving on to tonight's event and speakers. The Impossible Community: Realizing Communitarian Anarchism offers readers an accessible framework along with concrete case studies to show how contemporary anarchist practice continues a long tradition of successfully synthesizing personal and communal liberation. In it, Clark skillfully argues that a free and just social order requires a radical transformation of the modes of domination exercised through social ideology, the social imaginary, the social ethos, and social institutional structures. It's an innovative work that really appeals not only to anarchists and students of anarchism, but also to activists and anyone interested in transforming the world here and now. John P. Clark is a philosopher, activist, and educator. He has authored numerous books, including The Anarchist Moment, Anarchy, Geography, Modernity, and Between Earth and Empire. And he is also the director of the Terre Institute for Community and Ecology. Liz Lessner is a sculptor, educator, and writer. She creates novel sensory experiences by combining traditional fabrication techniques with emerging technologies. Liz created the Sensory Engagement Laboratory in Washington, D.C. in 2018, which has found multiple homes online and at Yes, We Cannibal, which folks will hear more about tonight. Matt Keel is completing a PhD in anthropology, geography, and philosophy at Louisiana State University. He's a practicing studio artist working with sculpture, film, and text, and is a practicing Buddhist. His experimental ethnographic dissertation explores new ecological thought with insights drawn from the multifold emergence of theories of the psychological unconscious, race, and nature. So John, Liz, and Matt, thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your work with us. And I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much for having us, Ash.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Now we have nothing to say. We're exhausted just hearing about it.
We have too much to say. We don't know where to start.
Well,
That's the dialectic, you know, not enough. So maybe we should just plunge into it.
well, it's funny in rereading this book, which was my introduction to John as first as just a compatriot and then as a dear friend and mentor and really family at this point. There is a passage in the first edition of the book that reads this way: create your own community of liberation. From this moment on, direct your most concerted efforts, your best work, and your greatest feats of imagination towards creating the impossible community. And do so, first of all, precisely where you are with those around you. And I was struck in reading this that I noticed that this is what we have done with Yes, We Cannibal. And so I wanted to say thank you, John, for this one particular passage, which was almost eerie to read at this point. But I really wanted to just kind of put out there the incredible influence that your work has had on us. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, John, your biography is so full of different engagements and transition points. And I thought we could start the way your book starts by talking about your own process of awakening. One of the things that I know that was so important to you was your own engagement with radical education. And later, the Institute for Social Ecology, as well as your work in Tibet and with the Papuans. So perhaps you could tell us about some of those points which were awakenings for you and how that process unfolded that led you to this book.
Okay. So basically, what has my life been about? First, I want to say, you know, you thanked me, but the greatest thanks I can get is exactly what you said you were doing as a result of, in part, in small part, but in part because of the book. If I could just go back to that, because, you know, that I really appreciated so much that you said that. I wrote a preface to the book called The Preface. I've always been intrigued by prefaces because people always write them last. It's really bad faith. You know, it's the preface, it's looking forward, but people always write the preface after they found out what they did, because they never really know at the beginning. And right at the beginning of the preface, the end of the first paragraph, it says, above all, this book seeks to convey the message, create it now. And one of the things that struck me after this book had been out for a while is how few people got in touch with me about how to create it now. There was actually one person who grew up in a therapeutic community that's quite extraordinary, and he got in touch with me and actually moved to New Orleans, and we talked about these things a lot. And I went to England and visited the community and exchanged ideas. And I was so happy about that. And a few other people have, but most people have not really reacted in the way I'd hoped with the idea of collaboration on creating it now, which is partly why something like Terre Institute started, and I guess why Yes, We Cannibal started. In that same preface, there's the idea that we've really known what to do for thousands of years. I'm not going to quote it, but it's three things about what we have to do. And the first is awaken ourselves, which is really what you were just talking about. Well, maybe I will say it. Second, dedicate ourselves to a path of liberation and solidarity. And third, find a community of others who are doing the same thing. And I think that is the solution. That's really what the whole book is about. So, there's a lot of history behind it, a lot of crises, a lot of new directions, breaks with the past and movement in different directions. Part of what I was thinking about when I wrote the book was my experience in the early 70s that you were talking about, Liz. This was, in a certain sense, it was what's called the 60s, but a lot of what people called the 60s really didn't develop until into the 70s, when people talked about things for a while and then they really started to do them. Certainly the 60s were not great on feminism. There's a real strong critique of what was going on in the left and so forth in the area of feminism and a lot of other personal issues, but it was beginning to develop. The cooperative movement really picked up also in the 70s. I was part of a group called the Black Pearl Mutual Aid and Pleasure Club through most of the 70s. And we were influenced by a lot of things. We were influenced by the situationists. In a sense, we were kind of post-situationists, the critique of the spectacle, the idea of everyday life being so important, the critique of everyday life, the revolution of everyday life, as Van Agel called it. And we really wanted to do it. Another great influence on us was Ursula Le Guin, and particularly at that time. Later on, Always Coming Home became one of the biggest influences on me, but at the time, The Dispossessed. And so we had this group, Black Pearl Group, and we had an affinity group within it, which was really the people who decided to work on things a little more often together. And we really consider ourselves Odonians. In The Dispossessed, the philosopher of Anaris is a woman named Odo. And she came up with this philosophy in her book, The Social Organism. We were just overwhelmed by this. Basically it was communitarian anarchism. We didn't use that term, but that was very important. Being involved in the alternative education movement, working for free schools, every kind of alternative, open classroom schools within the system, free schools outside the system. I was part of a group that started a couple of cooperative preschools that my kids were in, and I taught in one of those once a week. I kind of coordinated a little food co-op. And at that time, we had this feeling that all these cooperative institutions were developing and they were growing very quickly, and that they would continue to grow. And certainly 50 years later, a large segment of society would have been transformed according to ideas like mutual aid, cooperation, critique of domination, anti-hierarchy, all of these other ideas that we already had in a very naive way in many cases. And we were not good at putting it into practice, but we weren't all bad either. We did achieve a certain amount, but we did not know how to sustain it. We didn't know how to work together on the federative level, as anarchists have sometimes said, networking, federation, confederation, whatever term people like. But it was a very transformative era because we believed that basically vast social transformation was possible and that it could be done in an organic way. Later on, I discovered Gustav Landauer, who expressed a lot of these ideas very beautifully, well, with the concept of people, land, spirit, and so forth. And I discovered Avisé Reclus. We could talk about him also if you'd like, who was another communitarian anarchist. And we had this background of really 150 years of people talking about these things and experimenting to build on. And the question was really, can we build on it? You know, what can we turn our vision and our rudimentary practice into something that could transform society?
John, can I interject, because I really only discovered Gustav Landauer through you, and knew very little about him, and just I wanted to not let the reference kind of pass by people here who may not have read your book yet or be familiar. If you could just say a bit about his work, philosophy, and just time period. We will be asking about Reclus, so we can come back to that, but I don't want Landauer to get lost.
It'd be good just to mention him. I really recommend the PM Press and anthology collection of Landauer's works, which are really interesting and inspiring. You know, he wrote a book called The Revolution. He wrote a book called For Socialism, and he was a great figure in the libertarian wing of socialism, but he was really a communitarian anarchist, and he influenced Martin Buber a lot. And the kind of communitarianism that existed in the early, more radical kibbutz was very much influenced by the Landauer Buber tradition. Maybe I'll say one thing. There's a passage that in the book that that's about Landauer. On pages 89, 90, 91, I write about Landauer. And he's famous for saying the state is a relationship, and that we will really abolish the state by transforming our relationships so that statist relationships, we could also say patriarchal relationships, capitalist, economistic relationships, and we could go on, are replaced by other kinds of relationships. And there's an idea that I throw out at the beginning of that section about how we could change according to this kind of problematic of transition. The process of destatification would be proportional to that of the extent of communization. And I mean, the word communization has been used in various ways, and in many cases, not so good ways. But I mean, there's a lot of communization theory, which we probably shouldn't talk about. But in the sense that Landauer was talking about it, it was a very deep kind of personal transformation, a fundamental transformation in the direction of non-hierarchy, non-domination, and to get into the ethical part of it, really freedom as the flourishing of all beings. Let's kind of get to the point. That's also what the book is really about, that kind of vision of freedom. So I have this idea of revolutionary proportionality. We have to think about how far we have gone in changing the proportion between dominating relationships, instrumentalizing relationships, manipulative relationships. Buber talked about the I-it relationship. And he also said there was an I-you relationship, which is kind of neutral, but of course the I-thou, the du in German, was the one that he thought of as the personal, non-exploitative, accepting relationship. It's basically, I would conceive of it as a relationship of unconditional love, which I think is really what's at the heart of anarchism and non-domination. So I think in the early 70s, I write about the retreat of the state in that period. And some people have questioned that. I remember one person kind of made fun of it. Oh yeah, the state really retreated. But I discussed the ways in which the state retreated. And I think right now we can understand what retreat in advance of the state really means after the overturning of Roe and the specter of vast interference in women's lives and the lives of families by the state coercively. And it was in the early 70s when people like Richard Nixon and all kinds of Republicans were really retreating issues and great at civil rights also. In many ways, Nixon would be on the left of the Republican Party now, far left of the Republican Party, given the kind of environmental, civil rights, and other legislation that he actually signed, even if he wasn't enthusiastically for it, because there was this feeling that this was, kind of the wave of the future. And, oops, sorry. Thought I extinguished that. It's now extinguished. Unfortunately, it comes on my computer and it's now gone. Okay, technology. So where are we? That was the situation in the 70s. You know, that's one of those crisis periods in which vast transfer. I mean, of course, part of the crisis was in the late 60s, I was faced with the Vietnam War. And it really ultimately questioned all of the things that I had been indoctrinated with. And, you know, there was a vast shift in my outlook about society and politics. Another thing about Vietnam was that it was a very traumatic time. And it was a time in which everything was kind of loosened up. People were not sure what was going to happen. There was a kind of apocalyptic element. There's actually a movie that has apocalypse about that period. And you know, we're in an apocalyptic period now, but a much more deeply apocalyptic period. And you know what apocalypse is, by the way? It's a turning. It means a turning. And the question is, where will the turn go? It can be a turning that means, you know, what it's probably going to mean if we don't figure out the solution, which is a turning in the sense, a turn toward collapse and catastrophe. But it can also be a turning to a rebirth, to regeneration, which of course is really what all this is about that we're talking about right now.
It's interesting because even in just the first few minutes here, I hadn't really planned to ask you about the kind of influence of sort of non-dual, for lack of a better word, Eastern, largely Asian, Southeast Asian, you know, philosophy and religion. But I did notice that in the very beginning, in terms of talking about awakening and finding a community, it really paralleled Buddhism. You're really kind of talking about sort of the, you know, the Buddhist path. And then when we talk about the turning, the possibility of thinking about the apocalyptic as turning, it also really resonates with the kind of Buddhist, you know, notion of the next turning of the wheel. And so I just kind of wanted to put it there in the background in terms of thinking about it. Because I think you're quite unique in the way in which you've had these kind of Taoist, Confucius, Buddhist inputs. I think increasingly
Confucius, by the way, that's not really a big influence on me. I'm not against
there. Taoist, Zen, particularly Zen Buddhism.
There are other things. I mean, I'm a big Rumi fan, and I'm really happy that in my last book, I have a chapter that comes out of Islam. You know, which actually, especially I've spent time in India and there are a lot of influences there. And to me, one of the great experiences of my life has been to go with students to a great Sufi shrine and listen to a family that's been playing Sufi music for 500 years. And to me, it was one of the most overwhelming experiences. So I'm not sectarian anywhere. I don't like to say I'm a Buddhist. The Buddhist tradition in philosophy has probably been, along with Western dialectical thought, you know, it's one of the two most important things to me. And Zen has been very important, which in a sense is Taoism and Buddhism. But there are other influences, and you know, one of the things that I'm interested in is trying to figure out what we can learn from all these traditions, and of course, not only the so-called great wisdom traditions, but also all the indigenous traditions from around the world, and especially the ones that are closest to us. In fact, at Bayou La Terre, one of the activities that has continued through the pandemic is that there's an indigenous group that has a sweat lodge on the land, and they have been, the two things that have continued without interruption have been our bees making honey and the indigenous group doing sweat lodge, the Inipi group. So you know, to me, one of the challenges is to learn from all these traditions. And of course, this is very different from the classical anarchist, you know, free-thinking secularist kind of ideology that prevailed at one time.
We'd like to give a shout out that the honey that we have eaten from Bayou La Terre is far and away the best honey we've ever eaten, and it's an extraordinary beekeeper. But did you?
But John, maybe this is a really excellent segue to talk about bioregionalism and the focus your book puts on developing regional and indigenous traditions, especially towards the end, as a means for connecting people to their communities.
And also, just on top of that, for those people who in the audience may not be entirely familiar with like what is Bayou La Terre, and what is the La Terre Institute? I mean, what's the sort of quick summary of there's this land and then there's this institute, and they're kind of intertwined but separate? It'd be useful to explain to people.
Okay. Yeah, and I do have, I have some wonderful friends who did an art and sound program, and basically it's 88 Bayou La Terre is a little sandy creek which has amazing, beautiful clay deposits on it, in it, and we have 88 acres running about 2/3 of a mile along the creek, and we have a few structures, a couple of houses, cabins, and so forth, and well, to some degree, even though 30 years ago, when I first started the project, it wasn't an institute, but we basically had a cabin out in the woods with no way to get there except crossing a creek. You had to carry everything. You had to carry all the materials to build a cabin and a workshop and so forth. But now, at least for the last 8 years, there have been a lot of weekend programs, which we could talk about if there's time, but I really think this is probably something we should go into at another time. A lot of programs related to things like bioregionalism. There's just a wonderful podcast about 10 people were doing a tribute to Gary Snyder, the nature poet, who was a big inspiration to everything I've tried to work on. His book, The Practice of the Wild, is my favorite book about thinking about nature, but he has many, many wonderful books of poetry. And we do weekend programs on things like reading Gary Snyder. The t-shirt is from an art and sound program that was one weekend, which was really amazing. And out on the land, there is this old cypress, which is over 250 years old, that a friend of mine who documents old cypresses did a boring and counted the rings, and he says it's over 250. And I find it very inspiring that before there was a state of Mississippi, which is where the land is, before there was a United States, that tree was already towering over, oh, there it is. It's a very strange tree. It's been through a lot. You can see evidence of fire, of lightning strikes. It's a pond cypress, by the way. The bald cypress is much more common in along the Gulf Coast, but that's called a pond cypress, and I relate it very much to a story by the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, who writes about this old tree. There's a story of Zhuangzi and a friend of his walking along, and the person says, "Look at that worthless old tree. It's gnarled, it's twisted. You couldn't use it for lumber. You couldn't use it for anything. It's good for nothing." And Zhuangzi says, "Well, it knew how to survive for all of this time. It was good for that." And Zhuangzi is a great philosopher because he's a perspectivist, and he always tried to direct people to looking at things from the perspective of other beings. There's a story about he walks across a bridge with a friend who says, well, he looks down into the river and he says, "Those fish are very happy." And his friend says, "How do you know they're happy? You're not a fish." And he says, "How do you know that I don't know that they're happy? You're not me." And of course, it's a paradoxical. I mean, actually, this is why Taoism influenced Zen. It gives you a lot to think about. But the real point behind Zhuangzi is that we need to start looking at things from the standpoint. I mean, one thing we can probably assume is the fact that they weren't there catching the fish probably made the fish happier than they would have been. So, okay, the old tree. That's the story of the old tree.
And what are the programs of La Terre Institute, and how do they reflect bioregionalism?
Well, right now, our biggest things, other than the things I mentioned on the land, are online programs. We have a group that we co-sponsor with your group called the APE group, which is Anarchist Political Ecology. And actually, that group right now is doing an 8-week study of the book or discussion of the book that we're talking about tonight. We did one chapter so far, and we're we're going to be doing that for a while. The other group is called the Dialectical Social Ecology Group, which is another big story in my life of being associated with something called social ecology and then wanting to do something called dialectical social ecology because of what I saw as some of the non-dialectical limitations of what was called social ecology.
And John, we did, there actually already was a question in the Q&A here about Bookchin, and so maybe this would be a good time to just tell whatever you'd like to about that, a little bit of that history with the
Wouldn't mind if I could just finish saying what the dialectical.
Sure, of course. I just wanted to preface it. Yeah.
Because we almost got to that. I'd at least like to tell people that, well, the group read a book by one of my favorite philosophers named Catherine Malabou, who just did a book on anarchism, which I think is going to be one of the big important books on the theory of anarchism. It's called "Un voleur" in French, which means basically stop thief. And it's about how all these philosophers have stolen ideas from anarchism and then disavowed their anarchism and didn't want to talk about anarchism. But she wrote a book called The Future of Hegel, which we discussed. She's a great philosopher in many ways. Particularly, she's done a lot with neuroscience and neuroplasticity and the concept of plasticity in general, which was developed by Hegel, who did a lot of really bad stuff and also a lot of really good stuff. And we're focusing on the really good stuff and kind of laughing or frowning about some of the bad stuff. But we're reading his book called The Philosophy of Spirit, which is part of a 3-volume work that he did. And it's a very challenging work, but if anybody's interested in it, is that we're getting to there are 2 sections. One's called Subjective Spirit, which is about feeling, sensation, mental states, and a lot of subjective things. And the second half is called Objective Spirit, which is about what he calls spirit, or it's called Geist, out in the world, in the institutions of society. And I won't say any more about that, but I thought at least I'd mention it. I mentioned that there were a lot of crises. I mean, you know, the Vietnam War and then the wake of the Vietnam War and the kind of radical counterculture that was generated. And when I say generated, I mean, it raises a question, which is this question of reactivity, which I always urge people to think about, because when I do a self-critique of that period, I see so much reactivity in which we were reacting to the dominant system in ways that in many ways reflected the dominant system in a certain way. This is Spinoza, the philosopher, came up with this idea of negation as determination, or you can say determination as negation, that you're determined by what you react against. And in dialectical thought, there's this idea of the negation of the negation, which is that you also have to negate your negation to get beyond the limitations of the negation. And the philosopher Nietzsche, who actually said he hated dialectic, but was really a dialectical thinker in spite of himself, had a lot to say about reactivity and how bad it is for our, you know, our personality, our relationship to other people, and so forth. So you know, that was a period of great crisis and great transformation. I spent many years involved in social ecology, really from the early 70s to the early 90s. Although in the late 80s, I was beginning to become more critical of some of the aspects of it. Turned out you're not supposed to be critical of those aspects. So in the end, I mean, basically, I was banned from going to an international conference and told I had nothing to contribute. I just wanted to destroy social ecology. And I really didn't. I wanted to develop it dialectically. And that was not actually the concept of dialectic that prevailed within that milieu. But so I don't want to go into that very much. But fortunately, at the same time as that was happening, I got involved with West Papua. There was a huge corporation that was doing terrible things in the United States, particularly in Louisiana, where they were trying to dump millions of tons of low-level radioactive gypsum in the Mississippi River, destroying the ecosystem and the water supply in many ways. And I found out that the worst things that this corporation was doing, not surprisingly, was to tribal people in West Papua, the Papuan people. So I spent 10 years basically of everyday work. Every day I was involved in this work. I followed what was going on in West Papua, what kind of brutality, genocidal activities were going on in the, basically through an alliance with the between the Suharto dictatorship and this large corporation that was headquartered in New Orleans. So it was definitely an awakening experience. For one thing, I learned so much about how the global nation state, corporate, racist, neo-colonial system worked, which was very much neglected in a lot of the political theory that I was exposed to. I got to know the people. Some of the Papuan leaders came to New Orleans because they had a $5 billion suit against this corporation in both state and federal court. I would say I was very much transformed by the 10,000-year history of the Papuan people and the way it's expressed in their traditions, in their symbols, in their stories, in their lives. And also one thing that I learned from the Papuan people that's very much expressed in this book is what the commons is really about. And how that spirit was still alive within the Papuan people. I could tell you so many stories. I was profoundly influenced, not in general terms, but also by individual activists like Tom Bienal, who was the head of the Amungme Tribal Council, and Mama Josefa Alamang, who won the Goldman Environmental Prize, who was the leading woman cooperative organizer and leader of all sorts of things. And she was brutalized by the Indonesians. I find the story just very inspiring. And what she was arrested for and persecuted for was giving food to people, because the people were identified or claimed to be members of the OPM, which was the liberation movement. And her testimony in court was really amazing. She said, for thousands of years, we have practiced giving food to people who are related to us by any kind of kinship tie, which is very extensive, of course. And if someone who is my kin, which really means, the tribe, everybody, but if someone who's my kin comes to me and asks for food, I don't think, who is this person politically in relation to some outside political system? I give them the food. And, it was very moving to me that she suffered so much because she was practicing this fundamental communal value of sharing, on which the whole society is based, and in which, on which our society is not based, and which our society negates brutally. So that was a big part of my life. Basically for 10 years, I fought against that. The suits failed. We were not able to create the kind of movement that could defend the Papuan people. They're still under assault. But rather than go into that, I might just mention that there was one other really big crisis, which was Hurricane Katrina, which I do discuss to some degree in the book. And to me, that was the most transformative period of all, because the level of devastation was so great. I mean, one thesis of the book is that we need to be traumatized into recognition. Actually, one of the great chapters of Martin Buber's book is called In the Midst of Crisis. And Paths in Utopia is the name of his book. That crisis was an enormous influence on me, because I was in India with our India program, which has also been working with Tibetans for 15 years, has also been a big influence on me. But our program is in Upper Dharamsala, where it's the center of the Tibetan refugee community, and I've had a lot of interaction and work very closely with that community. But in 2005, while I was there, basically my community was devastated by a disaster. And when I went back, as soon as I could get back, which was a couple of weeks later, I found just vast destruction, suffering, great need. And I write about, in the last two books, I think I've written different sections on this experience. I became part of there's part of the community on Desire Street. I think I have a section called a street named Desire, kind of named after a streetcar named Desire. And my friend Leni Halbert opened up her home to people who came to participate in the recovery. It was a lot of anarchists, it was a lot of neighbors, it was a lot of people just of goodwill. And living and working with that kind of community was one of the greatest experiences of my life, even though it was in the midst of vast devastation. And I wasn't even sure about, what the future would be, or even whether everybody had survived at that time in my family. And I went on to work to some degree with the Common Ground Collective, which is, possibly the biggest anarchist-inspired project in recent decades. And there's a lot to say about that. And I think I learned a lot from the achievements, which were great, and also the failure to be able to do what people wanted to do, which was, for instance, to take over an apartment complex and turn it into cooperative housing. To start a lot of worker co-ops, and to do a lot of other things that would have really done a lot to create, a new world within the shell of the old. And some of it happened, but it did not happen the way we needed it to happen. And I had met the person who really inspired the Common Ground Collective, Malik Rahim. It's probably been at least 3 decades ago at this point. And I was always inspired by his vision of doing things like creating a lot of worker co-ops among people, particularly people who have been in prison and were kind of abandoned by the society and destined to go back to prison, usually out of desperation. And I was very much inspired from the beginning by Malik's vision. And we started a group called the New Orleans Cooperative Development Center, and we made certain efforts which, did not do what we needed. They didn't achieve their goal. And one of the things that I've always thought was that if we had been able to realize Malik's vision, say in 1990, by 2005, we would have had many, many local collectives that could have done the rebuilding, and we would have been spared the level of plunder and exploitation, and also division and conflict that came out of the recovery, and all of the anti-immigrant feeling, and all of the, I could say a lot about this because it's an enormous story, but the degree of exploitation was absolutely amazing. Particularly, just to give an example, there's something called squares, which is 100 square foot of tarp. And there's a certain price to put that, like there were hundreds of thousands of roofs that had to be tarped. When you look at the amount of money that was spent on a square, and then you look at what the contractor was paid, what the subcontractor was paid, what the subcontractor was paid, what the worker was paid. In many cases, it was something like 5 or 10% of the money that was put out went to the worker. So I don't want to go into it too much. It's a really big story. But if you want to know what disaster capitalism is, look at that story, and it'll give you some very powerful lessons.
How do you sort of, I'm always struck that to this day, Katrina is, I believe, 17 years ago. This year. Think projects like Lobelia Commons and Bayou Food Forest and the movement for sort of full solar New Orleans. These all feel like seeds that still come out of people's collective experience. So I still see some of the most optimism I feel here in Louisiana around these issues as they continue. I can still trace back in part to what you call sort of disaster anarchism. And so I find that inspiring. And it seems, I always wonder, do you see that as a lasting impact here? Do you sort of see?
Yes and no. It is what it isn't, and it is and it isn't, and that's one of the things we talked about, possibly talking about. But, I can never really give an answer, that's the way it is. Yes and no. this is what I believe. For instance, I was very active in Occupy. I went to 50 General Assembly meetings before I got disillusioned, which I think is amazing that I lasted that long. But anyway, I and another person started a solidarity economy committee within Occupy, and we had a series of educational things, meetings, films, all kinds of things about the solidarity economy. And people tend to say, well, Occupy was a failure. Well, it wasn't. We don't know the extent to which it is and isn't, because the results are not in yet. It's part of people's experience. The people who were in Seattle, with the anti-globalization events, have that as part of their experience. A lot of them brought that to New Orleans, when like 10,000 people worked with Common Ground. The people who came to New Orleans and worked in Common Ground got an experience of things like consensus decision-making, having training to try to work with local communities and not impose your ideas on them, to serve the community. People develop these abilities in the, really literally 10,000 or maybe many more people went through all this experience. And then, of course, there was Occupy, in which amazing things happened. And one of the things that inspired me about Occupy, I don't know how to run this computer. Please excuse me. I don't know if you heard that. But if I turn off my phone, the computer wants to tell me that somebody's calling me. Anyway, I killed it. The people's mic is what I was thinking about. Yeah. So that people who may not have had the courage even to talk in a large assembly of people, or may have very rarely done it, were speaking, and everybody was not only listening, but repeating every word. And to me, this was an amazingly inspiring thing in the sense of, democracy is not just majority rule. Democracy is something that happens to people. And to me, that was an amazing kind of transformational thing. So we have, Seattle, we have Katrina, we have Occupy, we have all of these things in which people get experience. And then the question is, what happens to that experience? Most of the time, it gets reabsorbed into the dominant culture. That's why I have all this analysis about spheres of social determination and what ultimately outweighs other things. But it doesn't disappear. It's always part of people. It's part of their past, it's part of their present, and it can be part of their future. Now, in different ways, it's more manifested at certain times. So the question is, how can we create the conditions? That's what the theory behind the book is about. How can we look at the social institutional structure, the social ideology, the social imaginary, the social ethos, and social materiality, and transform all of those so that what is, in a sense, virtual, potential, latent, slumbering within us can become manifested collectively. And of course, it becomes much more powerfully manifested when it is collective, and the more collective it is, the great. I don't like Proudhon at all, by the way, but Proudhon had this idea of force collective, collective force, and how we can multiply everything collectively. And it's true. And we haven't paid enough attention. Of course, for him, it was the principle of federation that brings us together. And of course, one of our problems is marginalization, where people end up doing a little project, which is wonderful. I mean, it might be more than wonderful. It might be the greatest thing in some people's lives, which is nothing to denigrate. But also, if we're faced with extinction, we're faced with ecological collapse, and if we have a sense of the whole, which is the biosphere. We didn't talk about bioregionalism much, but we could go back to that. The biosphere, the global ecological system, the connection between things. If we care about the future of life, future human generations and other generations, we have to think about how we can do things collectively in a way that we've never been able to do before. And one of the things that I got from Reclus is that when Reclus was writing, he was very active in the First International. There were ideas like the International. That was very much part of the radical social imaginary. Workers of the world, the International. There was also the idea of the Universal Republic that came out of the Paris Commune. There would be a commune of communes. The question I have is, what is there in the radical social imaginary today that takes the place of the Universal Republic or the International? It's very difficult to find those things.
John, can you also just for those who are going to read your book and have not yet read it, and may not be familiar with Reclus, who's not only someone who's been highly influential on you, but you also have done extraordinary translations of, and I think helped to bring back into more popular visibility. Could you perhaps kind of introduce him? I mean, his connection to Louisiana is so strong that it seems very meaningful.
Well, I discovered Reclus when I found this this document, Voyage to New Orleans, which he was a revolutionary from a very early age, like about his late teens, early 20s, and there was the coup d'état of Napoleon III, who ended up establishing the Second Empire. And Reclus and his brother marched to the mairie, the city hall, as revolutionaries. The story goes that it was a bunch of people, but by the time they got there, they were the only two left. So they both left the country. And Reclus ended up coming to Louisiana. He actually got a job as a tutor on a plantation. And he ultimately left because he was so appalled by the social system, but he learned a lot about slavery and racism. He became a lifelong anti-racist campaigner as a result of that. He was an extraordinary person. This was starting in the 1850s, 1860s. He was in Louisiana in the 1850s. He was a radical feminist. He was a radical ecologist. He was a vegetarian. He was a revolutionary in the first International Workers Association. I could go on and on. It was a multi-sided kind of revolutionary outlook that he developed and practiced. He did practice it. He actually was very active in the cooperative movement for a while, but he turned against it because it was turning into a kind of personal project for people. He has a passage in one of his writings where he says that about a group of people coming together to change the world, to have a revolution. And after a certain number of years, they are transformed into simple grocers. He says, they're doing their own project. And it's great. I think that he underrated, the cooperative movement. There's something about that. Unless you're part of a larger movement like the International, it's very easy for the revolutionary fervor, the revolutionary idealism, the dedication, the practice to be diluted and ultimately dwindle away. So we have to think about that. It becomes a kind of personal religion also. Like, I know the truth, I have the truth here, but what is the truth apart from the world?
It's one of the questions. We obviously have many more questions for you than we could possibly ask, but one of the things we think about with Yes We Cannibal is this very thing about, for lack of a better word, scalability. We have a project that is very, very engaged, very connected in its community, and we're loosely connected with many networks, but certainly there is no unifying large organization. But to get back to Reclus, the other piece that really interests me is Reclus is a geographer. And so, you have a bit of a name for yourself sort of in the geography circles. And you certainly talk about space quite eloquently in this book in a way that is, perhaps unique. And so I was kind of curious if Reclus had kind of accentuated your interest in sort of space and social explanation or social imaginary.
Yeah, I'm very critical of the concept of space, by the way.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I like to talk about space and place. And, you know, space tends in the Cartesian direction, abstraction and so forth. And, you know, one of the things I've talked about is like there's a war between turning things into space or allowing them to be place or become place. There's also this concept I like called, in French, it's espace, which is splice. You know, that in a certain sense, in the world, things are to some degree space and to some degree place. And there's kind of a war between them, like in urbanism and so forth. So to me, there's a question of how can we make sure that things remain placial and not just spatial, or they become more placial. If we want to use that word, we can make up another word if you'd like, but I mean, it's not really in the discourse that much. But to me, that's a major question. Space wars, right? Or space wars. You know, that to me is these are really big issues, and they're very practical issues. Also, I sometimes think the word we should use is geology rather than geography. You know, I mean, geology has been taken, by the way, I realize that. Okay, but you know, the logos of Gaia, you know, I like the idea of the logos of it, which is really you know, you can translate logos, you can make it a very Aristotelian kind of thing, but it's to me, it's also the Tao. The logos, Heraclitus's logos was the Tao, and it's also the Dharma. Dharma is the Dharma of nature. I'm interested in how different traditions have helped us with these ideas.
It's interesting because one of the first thoughts is with the Anthropocene, there has been a sort of movement to kind of transmute geography into geology, but you don't, the title of your most recent book is not the Anthropocene. You know, you chose the Necrocene instead.
For the subtitle. Yeah, I like the Necrocene. I tried other words, Thanatocene. I decided the reason I went for Necrocene rather than Thanatocene is Necrocene sounds scarier. And I think I think we're in a period where we need to be scared. We need to be inspired, and we need to have hope, but we also have to be scared, and we have to, you know, we have to do a lot of mourning, and we have to fear. You know, supposedly courage is knowing what to fear and what not to fear. It's not just not fearing anything. In a certain sense, you can't fear anything if you're not going to exist, but it seems to me, in another sense, you can. The idea, for instance, that future generations of human beings would go through the kind of collapse that was imposed on a lot of Native American societies in which people see everybody die. You know, imagine that happening to humanity as a whole. But also, what about all the other beings that are going to disappear? You know, people like to focus on climate change, but we're in the 6th great mass extinction of life on Earth. I was at a conference, it was an eco-socialist conference near Paris, and somebody stood up and they said, everybody knows that the big problem in this world is climate change. Well, being in the 6th great mass extinction of life on Earth is a hard one to beat, you know? I mean, at least we should put that on the list.
Well, there's so much more, John, that we could, you know, ask you, and I wish we could, but we haven't touched on sort of one of the big questions before we move to questions and answers, which is, you know, this book is about freedom. It's a, you know, sort of exploration of freedom in so many ways, and we just wanted to kind of give you the opportunity, for people who haven't read the book, may not be familiar with you, to kind of pose the broad question of how you would kind of introduce someone to that exploration, which is at the heart of the book. A kind of window into your thought around negative versus positive freedom, you know.
Yeah, the problem is it's 7:01, and so we're -1. So I think it's such
I thought we had half an hour. It's my mistake, then. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I would love to talk about that, because I think to me, one of the most interesting parts of the book, as I reread it, that doesn't mean it's most interesting to anybody else, but you know, was the part on freedom and domination, and I think it's something we really need to think about. But maybe we shouldn't think about it out loud right now, but we should give other people a chance.
Oh, we do have half an hour, so we do.
I think the last half hour is supposed to be questions from other people. Am I not right?
Oh, I think there's a little leeway, but so we could take.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought my super ego was getting at me, but
We certainly need to rush you to explain freedom in 1 minute. So
okay, so one of the things that I find really strange is that about anarchism, and this is why I like Catherine Malabou, who writes about this. Anarchists have not really said a lot about arche, which is domination. And I think we have to put a lot of thought into that, what domination is about. So I don't know how long, I think I wrote like I wrote 70 pages of this book about freedom and domination. And you know, what I do in the freedom chapter is a critique, in both of them, I do a critique of like liberal ideas of freedom and domination and so forth, but also the idea that there's a broader conception of freedom that includes like the negative freedom that so-called libertarians, right-wing libertarians focus on, non-coercion, not being told what to do, et cetera. And then positive freedom, which is freedom as a kind of self-realization, freedom as the attainment of certain things. And then there's also freedom as self-determination of a community, particularly communal self-determination. To me, all three are essential to a really developed conception and workable conception of freedom. The positive part is really the most important. I mean, I ultimately take the most important conception of freedom to be freedom as flourishing. It's kind of it's in the tradition of self-realization, self-actualization, but those are not the best words. The flourishing of all beings and of the biosphere of the earth, I think, is really the most reasonable, defensible conception of what freedom is really about. And that domination would be the opposite. It would be the institutions, the forces that create obstacles to that flourishing, to that realization, and of course also coerce people and prevent them from having self-determination. So, you know, there's a lot more to it, but if I'm supposed to do a 1 or 2 sentence summary, that would be it.
Well, just to sort of chime in, I mean, this is one of the most rewarding, I think, parts of the book for me, is the very, very nuanced exploration of domination. So while we may get into it in the question and answer, I mean, to me, that's one of the contributions in this book that is really unique. You know, and so I know perhaps that is a good time to see if we have questions. I know there's 2 questions here in the Q&A.
I could just mention, if anybody's really interested in that, even if they don't want to come for 8 weeks, they could join our group for those 2 weeks on freedom and domination, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks.
And we could actually post the link to that group in the chat, or we could give it to Ash to send out if people are interested.
Right.
But John, there's a question here from someone who wanted you to share the name one more time regarding the person's testimony about handing out food.
The Papuan.
The Papuan.
Mama Yosefa Alamang. And if you can look up who won the Goldman Environmental Prize over the years. Alomang would be her last name. Yosefa is with a Y. And she came to New Orleans. She spoke at Loyola, where I was teaching at the time. Also, Tom Bienal, who is the other person I mentioned, the head of the Amungme Tribal Council, spoke at Loyola, and I transcribed his talk, and I'm not sure, I put it online somewhere. You know, I could send it to people if they want. It was very beautiful and amazing.
And the link in the chat.
I mean, I don't want to, there's so many things I'm tempted to talk about, because when you work with people for 10 years, you know, there are a lot of stories, not just abstractions. You know, you get to know who these people are, and you really appreciate their culture so much more deeply when you know the nuances of it. I really admire them. Actually, some people know Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I think it has strong points, and it can also be criticized. But one of the amazing things about that book is the reason he wrote it is because he did field work on the Papuan people. And he had this question: how can people who are so smart, so extraordinary, be considered the lowest of the low. You know, they're just parodied. They're these headhunter, you know, savages, all this. And he knew them. They're people who speak 5 languages, you know, because it's such a diverse culture. To live in a village, you have to know the languages of 5 or 6 surrounding villages just to communicate with people. And the skills are amazing. But anyway, that book was inspired by Papuan culture.
Did you want to?
So we've got another question in the chat about, in your opinion, is there anything of value to take from Bookchin?
Oh yeah, there are many things, and I guess, okay, this is another subject that, you know, I had a conversation with him once, if you really want to know the answer to this question. And I told him, it was when there was a little bit of friction developing, but the split was not so big. And I said, I'll always give you credit, you know, for what you have contributed. And I really, in some ways, because there's been so much conflict, I've ended up focusing on a lot of the weak points. And I think it's important to recognize the strong points. And some of the strong points, I mean, he would not like to hear it this way, is that he transmitted ideas that were very important to a new generation. Now, he often acted like he invented the ideas. Now, he did his own kind of variation on them, and he did come up in some of his variation I'm not satisfied with. But you know, I think part of the reason why, in some ways, the communitarian anarchist tradition exists as much as it does is because of him. And so I think he deserves credit for that. But I think everybody has to, you know, I'm very critical. I admire Reclus so much, but I criticized him about his view of the cooperative movement, but he would never have banned me from a conference, you know. And so I just wanted to destroy everything because I disagreed on it. I thought his assessment was partially right, but I think he overlooked the potential. Like, for instance, I really admire Cooperation Jackson right now. To me, it's like the best thing that's going on in an organization on the local level in the United States. When I give examples of things I love, you know, I mentioned the Zapatistas, I mentioned other indigenous things that are going on in Latin America, Rojava, a number of other things. But I mentioned the one in North America I always mention is Cooperation Jackson. And they are really inspired by the Mondragon cooperatives. Like Kali Acuna, you know, is kind of their spokesperson, really always talks about this. And, you know, so I think we have to use good judgment and not become, you know, okay, I also think that part of the way I look at this is because I became very sectarian at a certain period, and I lapsed into that. And there were things about Bookchin that I didn't think were right, and I would not say that. I would not say them. And I had a kind of job of attacking certain people, and I did my job. You know, like I wrote an article called Marx's Inorganic Body, which in some ways is a good article, but it's very one-sided. And a lot of people have read it. It's about Marx and ecology. But later on, I wrote another article called Marx's Ecologies, which is looking at the different aspects of Marx, like not the vulgar Marxist view, or, you know, Marx at his worst. Like 1/10 as many people, when you see how many people have read it, like 9 out of 10 read the hit job, you know, and 1 out of 10 reads the more balanced view. Not that the one-sided was wrong, but it was one-sided. So I became very skeptical of sectarianism. So that's part of what that's about. But I thought The Ecology of Freedom was a very good book. And I regretted to see Murray's evolution after that, for instance, away from recognizing indigenous society as much as he did there. And some of the other things, like he was kind of sympathetic to bioregionalism. Later on, he really had scathing criticisms of bioregional is really a parody of it. But, you know, the early Bookchin to me was very inspiring, like Toward an Ecological Society and the period when he wrote those things. So you know, I mean, it's a big subject to assess somebody's work as a whole, but obviously there's strong points and weak points.
Well, I'm not sure if there's any other questions from the audience. We'd love to have them if you want to convey them through Ash or through this Q&A section, but maybe that's a good transition to something we didn't get to talk about earlier, John, which is you kind of take Bookchin to task for his use of language. In one section of the book, you call it, I think, Humpty
Dumpty language. Yes.
Yes.
Using a word, he determines what a word means.
Yeah, I mean, I've done very careful readings of this stuff, and there's a kind of word mysticism in his writing, in which he makes a word mean something. But the whole point is, it is what it isn't. You know, it always, you know, I mean, people have thought about these things a lot, and you can't just, you have to be very flexible with language. You have to understand the nuances, you have to understand different uses, you have to pin down, like, how are you using it in a certain case. But then on the other hand, you know, I've written a bunch of books by another name, not another name from books, they are called books, but my name is different on these other books, and I don't consider it any less me or not me than the not me or me that you're talking to. But you know, it's all about the creative use of language. I'm very much influenced by Dada, by surrealism, and a lot of other things. So there's a question, you know, for instance, if you're doing critical theory or analysis, analytical work on a text, you have to have a certain type of precision and also flexibility of mind. And one of the things that's helped me a lot is I did a lot of translation. And if you do translation, you cannot have the idea, I want to make this mean what I want it to mean. You're working all the time. You're working to try to communicate with the reader, to be respectful of the writer. And also, you know, we're working on Reclus. The original stuff was from the 1850s. So I was trying to figure out what things meant historically in the 1850s. So it's very hard work that is extremely gratifying and helpful in your ability to do what you need to do with language. So so that to me is very important. And with the Max Caffard writings, a lot of it, particularly the book Lightning Storm Mind, is the only book that I've ever written, if I can call it a book that I've written, which I'm not at all sure of. It's the only one in which the form of the book was relatively in line with the conception of the book, the hopes for the book, you know, the kind of values that the book expresses.
John, who is Max Caffard and what does his name mean?
Yeah, he's real. Max Caffard.
What's the question?
Max Caffard, who is that?
Who is Max Caffard and what does his name mean?
I think you should tell me.
There is a kind of,
you know, that's true. In a certain sense, that's what life is about. The world is constantly telling you who you are, for better or worse. And do you have any more right to that than anyone else does? This is RK, by the way. In the book Lightning Storm Mind, in particular, I write about this, about what is anarchic writing? What is writing of non-domination? And one of the things I like about Catherine Malabou is that she talks about RK as meaning commencement and commandement. In other words, it's origins, it's about origins, and it's about rule. And the RK tells you that there's some privileged origin to things. I mean, we know a lot of it, like the extreme case of it is the Supreme Court and these people who talk about the founders and original intent. That's the most archaic conception imaginable of language, that you're going to figure out original intent. And of course, you know, if like, let's say we're facing global ecological catastrophe and decisions have to be made about it. would the way to do it figure out what the original intent of some guys who lived hundreds of years ago was? That seems like me like a certain way to make totally insane decisions and allow the biosphere to collapse. It's so insane, it's unbelievable. But RK is about looking for our origins and then also, hierarchical command coming from this privileged position. So one question is, how can we write that way? How can we speak that way? Big question.
But it's fascinating because you have this real, I mean, you're a delightful person to just talk to because you are so sharp with language and you're so precise and understand language.
But the Tao is vague.
Indeed. But you pay so much attention to language. It's such an incredibly active field whenever, I converse with you, and you have this whole kind of parallel track of interest in surrealism and Dada, Max Caffard and David Lynch, that to me, knowing you, the more I know you, the more that it makes sense in conjunct with, a book like this one, but in a way it's a different practice. And I find it interesting that they sort of, do you know what I'm saying, Liz, that they kind of maintain their own identities.
They are what they aren't in the body of one individual.
Indeed. There's a unity there in the is and being of the is not.
But I think we still have not uncovered the multiple meanings of Caffard, which you as a translator.
You really want to talk about that. It's in the book. I think it's in the book. I have this section called on anarchology or anarchography. It might be whatever it is, but it's kind of an autobiographical thing of the non unitary self, but it's something we have to think about. So, one of the things that happens when you this, I didn't come up with that persona. It appeared to me. It just appeared. The name appeared and the kind of writing emerged. And I just tried to follow it where it was going. One of the things I'm interested in is negative capability. We're always trying, this is one of my big differences with Bookchin. He had a very masculinist kind of outlook. He talked about this, the polis being the social gymnasium in which you develop muscularity of thought. The last thing people need is muscularity of thought, They have to get rid of some of those muscles. And they have to, develop plasticity in many ways. So it's about that. So if you really want to know, this name appeared. And in French, the word cafard means many things. It means a cockroach, which I consider to be a bioregional animal of New Orleans, we have these scary flying roaches, and that's one meaning. Le cafard means the blues. And there's some famous pieces of music. There's one called J'ai le cafard. It's like Creole music from New Orleans. So to me, the blues is something very much related to New Orleans culture, particularly rhythm and blues. But also, there's a larger region here where blues is really important. And also, I consider the blues to be like the mood of our age. By the way, you can't come up with a word that will mean all these things. Like I make a list of all these things I want it to mean, and then I pick a word. No, the word leads you to the meanings. And another is in French, there's the word cafarder, which means to tell on people. Like in school, the kid that tells them cafarder, and so I write a lot of satirical stuff under that name. I don't know if I do that because of the name or the name just happened, but then I learned that the French word cafard comes from the word kafir in Arab, which is the word that was applied particularly to Black Africans, and it meant infidels. So I kind of like the fact that tied in with cafard and cafarder. And I could go on forever. There are so many connections between these words. I mean, somebody told me, obviously it was taken from Kafka, who wrote a book about somebody who wakes up and had turned into a big insect. which some people say was a kafir, but that's not where it came from. But I mean, I hadn't even thought of that when somebody told me about that link. I mean, the surrealists had this concept of objective chance, where things just happen to fit together some way, and that's true.
Wow.
We live in a world of amazing connections, and it becomes a much more interesting world when you start looking at the connections.
We have, that was kind of mind-blowing. I didn't know about the kafir connection. That's really kind of quite incredible. But we have one last question here, which is kind of pointed, which is, could you offer a word of support or encouragement for communities who are struggling to maintain mutual aid networks in the face of state oppression and bad faith actors that seek to destroy those networks? Speaking from Phoenix, Arizona, it is one hell of a fight to feed and care for one another outside the current system.
Right. Well, I guess one of the things I would say is about this idea of force collective and the fact that we can multiply our power by working together. And one of the things that always amazed, and we didn't talk about therapeutic communities, which is one of the most important things that we might have talked about. I think we need therapeutic communities. I mean, there are two terms for what I try to defend in this book and the later one, which is, I call them communities of liberation and solidarity, and also communities of awakening and care. And one of the things you find, and including in some of the therapeutic communities and self-help kind of communities that I've been familiar with, that people multiply their power by working together. And is there something else?
No, I actually was, we had asked about therapeutic communities, and I think we missed over, but I think it's such an important concept. And there's one more question, but we have time for both.
Yeah, but I mean, what this one is very important, that we have to stop doing things individually and work together and create communities that can take care of themselves and others and grow. And, you know, one of the things that amazes me, I know there's not really time to go into it, but I've always been amazed at how the capitalists organize communities and how we try to organize communities. You know, basically some corporation, a developer buys up hundreds of acres of land. They bring in tractors, bulldozers, they put in streets, electrical work, and within a few months, they have a subdivision, okay, which looks like every other subdivision. And people then move in and commit themselves to spending 20 or 30 years of their life working hard to pay for the right to live in a boring subdivision that looks like every other subdivision and is not conducive to flourishing of human beings. And you know, 5,000 people live there then. Why aren't we doing more of that? You know, why aren't we creating communities? I mean, we're put on the spot if we do that, because then we have to show that we can live together in solidarity and we can flourish together, that we can make it work. But the other stuff doesn't work. So we're, you know, we can't do any worse. You know, and I'm inspired by we have a community that was in Louisiana that lasted over 20 years called New Llano in West Central Louisiana, which is now Trump territory, but was IWW territory then, popular, you know, radical populist, had socialist mayors and all of these sort of things. They created an amazing community for a certain period of time. And we know we can do it. And we can take care of ourselves, and we can welcome many other people who can help us take care of ourselves together. So I think in a way that's the side. I can't really answer that question exhaustively, but that's kind of a hint.
But when I first met you, John, one of the first things that you told me about was this idea of therapy. I was very interested in intentional communities and really moving somewhere to live among others. And you told me about therapeutic communities as something that was almost like a bit like a distributed commune, a kind of ethos of care that really wasn't necessarily all cohabitating, but was forming kind of sort of social networks. And to me, it remains one of the most powerful solutions. And we do have one last, sorry, go ahead.
The one in England that I visited and spent a little time, and I read hundreds of pages of work that had been with extensive quotes from the people in it. That one has about 100 people in it. They live in separate homes, but every family is encouraged to get a house or apartment with an extra bedroom, so that when people move to the community, they can move in with a family that's already in the community, who can then help them get established, get a job, become part of the community, become part of the decision-making process, work with it. And the community has this big house as their center, but people don't all live there. Anyway, there's many things, you ultimately have to get into the practical questions about how to do it. And that, you have to study what works, really.
There was a final question about just wanting to ask you, or it will be our final question. What is your opinion of Chomsky and his use of language? To me, it seems he seems to misunderstand his own use of linguistics.
Well, I mean, obviously we have to recognize him as a big figure in linguistics, but he has a great analytical mind. He doesn't have a great speculative mind or creative mind, really. So, I mean, he's very good at what he does. And I'm in awe of his ability to do what he does. And the fact that, even at his age, he has this exhaustive memory. And, one of the things I got into when I was working on West Papua is East Timor, which is, very close to West Papua. I got very much involved in East Timor support activities. And one of the people who did the most good work for East Timor was Chomsky, and I tried for a long time to get him to come to New Orleans to talk about West Papua, because he knew everything about West Papua. I mean, before I even invited him or anything, I said, "Oh, I know what you're doing in relation to the West Papua struggle." And he just seems to know what everybody's doing everywhere. So that's amazing. But philosophically, I would not recommend trying to get your philosophy from Noam Chomsky. But he's an amazing figure. I have to, with no reservations, I can say, he's on a level of brilliance that's just absolutely amazing.
I think that's a positive place to end. Maybe in the
I had dinner with him and Bookchin once, by the way.
What?
You dinner with
I
them?
had dinner with Bookchin and Chomsky once. And I had to sit next to Bookchin on one end and not talk to Chomsky. I also invited Chomsky to come to Loyola and, sponsored him and all of that. But when I was around Bookchin, like in the sectarian days, it wasn't good, like, to go too close to the Chomsky end of the table. This was in Montreal at a conference, a big event where Chomsky was really the big speaker, which was another problem from that point of view.
John, thank you so much. It's just your generosity is really unparalleled. We're so happy just to be.
Well, thank you so much. And I just feel so grateful that the two of you exist and the project that you're doing exists.
You too.
Well, we're inspired by you and your work, John,
every time we talk to you, and we love you so much. So
yeah.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Liz and Matt, thanks so much for sort of like hosting and crafting this discussion. And John, for taking the time to answer questions. And
I look very spooky now. It's dark. I just noticed I don't have a lot of lights on in this room. It's light when we started, but now it looks like the late horror show or something.
We just got in the zone with the
yeah, Giffard will come out soon.
You took over.
Well, for folks who are still here in the room, the book is The Impossible Community, Realizing Communitarian Anarchism. I know a bunch of folks have already picked it up, but if you haven't yet, I will drop a link in the chat, and there's a lot more in there about the things. A lot of what has been discussed tonight is expanded on in the book. So I do hope folks will pick up a copy and keep the conversation going. Liz, Matt, John, thanks so much. And it was great to connect with y'all. I look forward to seeing what happens in the future and would love to stay connected.
Oh, yeah, to everyone. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good night, folks.
Take
Goodbye.
care.